Hi, everybody, and welcome back for our next text study of the Gospel of Mark. These studies go up on Mondays, and we invite you to come join us here at St. Mark on Wednesdays at 10 o'clock. You can join either by coming into the Bonhoeffer room and being with us in person. You can join on Zoom as well. Please remember that next week, September 25th, we are not having class. So please, there will not be a Monday upload video, and there will not be a Wednesday gathered class. So please bear that in mind. But we do have class this week. We do have this video this week. And as you can see, we're looking at Mark chapter 9, verses 30 through 37. This is the story where Jesus discloses for the second time that he's going to die and to be raised. So it's very similar to the story we read last week in many respects. It's also different in some respects. So as we read through this story, I just invite you to kind of keep an ear out for the similarities and differences. You might want to kind of put a thumb on one page and a forefinger on the other and go back and forth in your Bible as you read them. There's repetition here, and repetition means something. So let's try to honor what Mark means by the repetition, both in terms of their similarities and their differences. So let's begin by just reading through the story very quickly. They went on from there and passed through Galilee. He, that is Jesus, did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him. And 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child and put it among them. And taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." And that ends the reading. All right, so let's look at the outline. This story has really 3 definable parts, like last week, only this one's set up in verse 30 with a setting. It will be when Jesus discloses his death. We will see the disciples responding in some way or another, like we did last week. And it will be followed by a teaching that includes some paradox statements, like we saw last week. So a lot of similarities. Let's walk through each part of this together. In the story, it says from there, so you want to ask, where are they starting out as they're journeying in this verse into Galilee, into Capernaum? And what we had heard was they had been in Caesarea Philippi. So that's often called the Galilee of the Gentiles. It's named after Roman emperors. And Jesus was up there. Then he came to the mountain where we have the story of the Transfiguration, and then came down the mountain. And it's after that story that now we're journeying from that area back to Capernaum. And there's an interesting question. It says, Jesus, he did not want anyone to know. They went to Capernaum not wanting anyone to know. And Mark doesn't tell us what exactly it is that Jesus doesn't want anyone to know. So I can think of 3 possibilities, each of which are plausible in some way. So something for you to kind of ruminate on between now and Wednesday. You know, does that phrase mean that they're just trying to get away from the crowds? It's very possible, and it certainly wouldn't be the first time. We saw in the 2nd chapter when Jesus healed Simon Peter's mother-in-law, that suddenly the entire city surrounded the house, and Jesus was healing and releasing people from demonic oppression and all those things. And during the night, he sneaked away by himself into a secluded place until he was found by the disciples. And we saw when the 12 were sent out to a missionary journey, when they got back, right after the death of John the Baptizer, Jesus said, let's go to a secluded place by ourselves. So he's taking them with him. And again, the crowd came and found them there. And then you had the story 2 weeks ago that we read in worship about how Jesus went up to Tyre, a country just north, and didn't want anyone to know he was there. And that's when the Syrophoenician woman finds out and comes and begs him to heal her daughter. So this would not be the first time that they're simply trying to get up by themselves for reasons known to Jesus. And that might be what this phrase, not wanting anyone to know their whereabouts, might mean. But another thing they may not want people to know is where they're going. Jesus has disclosed that he's going to be rejected by the chief priests, scribes, and elders. He hasn't explicitly said in Jerusalem. Up until now, in Mark's gospel, Jesus has only been in Galilee and north of that. And so we haven't had any stories about Jesus going into the southern region of Judea or into the city of Jerusalem. It could be that that's the direction they are now going, and Jesus is not wanting that to be spread abroad. This will be the last story that takes place in Galilee. So it's the end of the 9th chapter, and then the next chapter opens that they are now in the region of Judea. So just bear that in mind, that one thing they may not want people to know is that they're heading toward Jerusalem. Or he may not want them to know what he's now disclosing to his disciples. And he's telling them, as we'll see in a second, about his death and so forth. Maybe he doesn't want everybody to know about that. That's a little strained as a possibility, because last week we saw in chapter 8, when Jesus was telling the disciples about his death, Mark says he said all of this quite openly. It could be that given the response of Simon Peter and the others to that teaching, that instead of broadcasting that openly, now Jesus is trying to talk more intimately in order to explain what the implications of that teaching is. But so Mark just gives us the words he did not want anyone to know, and it's left up to us to think, what is it exactly and who is it exactly that Jesus didn't want to know what, right? I can think of 3 possibilities. You may be able to think of more. So now we're in Capernaum, in a house, the house it's called. You'll recall that Jesus, born in Nazareth, made Capernaum his home. He's been rejected by Nazareth, as we'll see in Luke's gospel very clearly, but he makes his home in Capernaum, and this may be the house where he stayed, either as a guest or by himself, I don't know. But he's there in Capernaum, kind of the home base in the house. And it's here in verse 31 that Jesus offers the second of the disclosures about his forthcoming death. So let's look at that. In the first disclosure, in Mark 8:31, Jesus talks about how the Son of Man must undergo great suffering, be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. In 9:31, Jesus again uses the title Son of Man, so that's a similarity. But instead of talking about suffering, he brings in a new term. He'll be betrayed. And instead of naming the elders, chief priests, and scribes, he simply says betrayed into human hands. Again says he'll be killed. Again says 3 days later he'll be raised. So that's, you can see in my excellent color coding here, the similarities and the differences between these two disclosures. Essentially the same, but in some of the finer points expressed a little differently. So now we're going to see the response of the disciples. And you'll remember that last week when Jesus said in 8:31 that he was going to go and suffer and die and be raised, that the first thing that happens is Simon Peter takes him aside and rebukes him. So a very inappropriate response, and of course Jesus will rebuke all of them after that for resisting taking up their cross and following. So let's see what the disciples' response is here. And in doing so, it's in verses 32, 33, and 34. Verse 32 says something very, very interesting. And again, this may be, Jesus may have changed his open discussion about going to Jerusalem into being a more intimate discussion based on how badly it went the first time. But certainly the disciples seem to be smarting a little bit from that first encounter, because Mark says they didn't understand what he was saying and they were afraid to ask him. So it seems that something has been disrupted in the relationship between Jesus and the disciples. They're scared to ask anything about this disclosure, but they don't understand it. They don't understand it. So the first reaction of the disciples is this lack of understanding and a fear to find out more. But bear that in mind. What happens next is actually a conversation about what took place before Jesus made this disclosure. But this is their immediate reaction. They don't understand and they're afraid to ask. But then there's the street talk, right? This is where Jesus asks them. Remember that word ask. As I pointed out last week, there are a couple of good verbs one could use in Greek to say Jesus asked. This particular word could be a little stronger, more like interrogated, quizzed. It could carry a little stronger implication than simply wonder and asking out of wonder. But Jesus asked them what they were discussing on the road from where they were, from there to Capernaum. They had a conversation, perhaps a heated one, and perhaps one of those conversations that they carried out, and every time Jesus got close, their voices went down, or they stopped talking altogether, and then they'd start doing it again, perhaps imagining that Jesus wasn't aware that they had a conversation. I happened to read both last week's lesson and this week's lesson as rather heated conversations. Heated between Jesus and the disciples, and I'm going to imply heated among the disciples. I think this was a hot conversation they were having along the road. And Jesus asked them, what were you talking about along the road? And the answer is really kind of curious, and frankly could be translated a couple of different directions. I want to look at that more closely with you on Wednesday, the possibilities of the translations here. Because there's an interrogative pronoun that's being used. One thing they were talking about could be translated, who is great, or who is the greatest. Who is great. So that interrogative pronoun could be translated in terms of personage. Who is great? But that pronoun could also be translated as what. And so it's less about person, more topical. What is greatness? What does it mean to be great? The translation we have in our scriptures takes a little bit of license with this. And gives us the impression that what they were arguing about on the road was who among them was the greatest. And that may well be. I don't know. It is a little bit of a speculative translation, but not an unfaithful one and not a bad one. It's just one of several options. If we translate that interrogative pronoun, who, then yeah, who is great? Who is the greatest? If it's what, then it would be like, what is greatness? And the reason I bring this up is because Jesus had just told them that in order to save their life, they must lose it. Jesus has just told them that he's going to be rejected, to suffer, to die, and then to be raised. This seems to be blowing their whole expectation of what they meant when they were saying to the others, he is the Christ. And so now that leaves you with the question, well, if Jesus is going to be crucified, there's no mention of the cross yet, but if Jesus is going to be put to death, executed, and raised, yeah, sure, but put to death after suffering, what kind of Messiah is this? Is this what it means to be great? To be God's people? To be God's chosen one? So it could be the question of what is greatness, or it could be the question, who is great among them? Who's the greatest? Simon Peter, I'm sure, thinks he is. We'll see in a future story that James and John thought they were. So it's an interesting question. We're not as sure exactly the best way to translate it. I'm not. Biblical translators seem confident. But they were arguing about greatness along the way. And that leads to the next teaching, very similar to what we heard last week, but also presented quite differently. It starts in verse 35 by saying, he called the 12. And you might be asking yourself, why did he have to do that? They were already on this journey. Now they are in a house. Now he's asking them what they were talking about on the way. It would seem like it's just Jesus and the 12. But I want to offer you this picture in your head as you read this story. They have just arrived back in Capernaum at the house after a distant journey. So they may have packages that they've been carrying, wraps, blankets, sleeping bags, food, staff, all the kinds of things someone would carry on a long journey like that they may need to unpack and maybe wash and so forth for the rest of their journey. They have presumably been away from home and perhaps family, and so now that they're back in Capernaum, they may be settling in and reuniting with their family. We are going to have a child here in the room somewhere, so it's not just Jesus and the 12. So I would imagine that after they get to Capernaum, everybody's kind of moving this way and that because they're back from their trip. They're unpacking, repacking, welcoming, being welcomed, all those kinds of things. And then Jesus discovers that they're arguing over greatness, and they're not getting it. They are not understanding. So Jesus calls the 12. Again, calls them together and teaches them another paradox. Whoever wants to be first must be last and servant of all. So this is a direct answer to the question of what is greatness? Who is great? Maybe not who's relatively great among the 12, but what does it mean to be great? Well, what it means to be great is to be last and servant of all. That's what it means to be first, proto, to be great. And then to really press this, it says that Jesus took a child and placed it in the midst of them, and then holding the child makes that very arresting comment that whoever welcomes a child such as this in my name welcomes me, and not only me, but welcomes the one who sent me. That's a really profound teaching. And so on Wednesday, I want to slow down with that and look at the three verbs that Mark uses to describe how Jesus presents this child to them. And then we want to look at the teaching that comes out of it and the three significant parts there of welcoming a child, which is the same thing as welcoming Jesus, which is the same thing as welcoming God. And that will lead us to the question of ourselves as disciples, of what it means to be part of a church that is sent into the world, an ascending church, a church that is an ambassador on behalf of Jesus Christ, on behalf of God. And that's where it takes us. All right? So that's our scripture. We'll delve into things a little more deeply on Wednesday. We'll bring your questions, and we'll be happy to entertain those and see where they take us as well. It'll be Wednesday at 10 a.m. And you can go to stmarkpresbyterian.org to our calendar. And if you go to that calendar, you can click on Wednesday at 10 o'clock, our Zoom link, and you can join us by Zoom that way. If you can be here in person, that's always wonderful. And of course, if you have any questions, need any guidance on this, you can contact us here at info@stmarkpresbyterian.org. If you're on my mailing list and you don't just go to our YouTube page to find these studies, I do have an outline for Wednesday's discussion that I send out and will be sending out today on Monday. If you're not on my mailing list, would like to be on it so that you can get those outlines, just let me know. I'll be happy to add your name to it. Okay? That's going to do it for now. Thank you very much. Bye.